me in this distinguished group of experts. When I received the invitation to talk about cognitive warfare in the framework of the war in Ukraine, coming from academia, of course, I first looked at the term, which I didn't come across before. We do a lot of research at Stanford to look into how social media and new technologies affect the framing of geopolitical conflicts and so forth. But when I looked through the material that was handed out, I thought, what is it? What are we talking about here? And I want to make 3 points. The first one is a methodological comment, because I think when we look at cognitive warfare as a term, it can either be a political goal, like how NATO decided this is something that we should address as an objective, and then it makes sense because they are trying to build a strategy to make use of this for the purposes that they point out as their mission statement. Is it something descriptive that distinguishes the term from other forms of manipulation, propaganda, fake news, whatsoever? Or is it something that helps us to analyze what is happening? And if we use it as an analytical tool, and my perspective was first more from a meta level and not how Captain Tian introduced it as who's right in the battle on the use of cognitive warfare. If we look at it from an analytical point of view, then I think it's not a very useful term, because from what I got from the readings that were sent out, it is not so much about the pieces of information and what we digest in our way of thinking, but it is a form to change our way of thinking. And if we think of what changes our way of thinking, then there are so many open questions about the application of this concept that I don't think that it will really help us much to explain a particular situation like the war of Russia in Ukraine, which doesn't mean that it's not happening, but everyone has a different understanding of what he or she thinks when he or she hears the term cognitive warfare. And that has to do with the time frame. Like if I hear something like the Chinese embassy has been bombed in Kosovo and therefore NATO is a terrible organization and potentially threatens China, then my way of thinking about this fact is it's probably a mistake, or it wasn't in NATO's interest to do this. There are different interpretations what happened in Belgrade, but I tend to believe that it was a mistake and not a strategic decision to attack China militarily on its soil in an extraterritorial property like the embassy in Belgrade. And the reason why I think so is that I'm a product of civic education that started in Germany after World War II, when we learned to belong to the West. And ever since, all forms of what makes our pluralist, Western-type, discourse-based, Western-type democracy what we think it is an ongoing debate in whatever form by executing freedom of speech to structure, format our way of thinking. So if there's an additional proactive approach to make me think differently about something, I cannot measure to what extent this intention, no matter if it's NATO or whoever, is successful, or if it simply comes from joining a conversation with the gentleman here, who also affect my thinking because it's a form of education. And after this enlightening conversation, I might think differently about the war in Ukraine because I get new perspectives and I get new information, and then I share it with my students and it has an effect on the ground, and then it sums up to a different interpretation. So it's a question of when does it start, our way of thinking, and how it is formatted, who are the actors, is it intentional, are we only speaking of technology or other new forms that haven't existed before, when in every possible conflict in the past, we had conflicting narratives, who is right and who is the aggressor and who's only acting in terms of self-defense and interpreting international rule in the one way or the other. So there are a number of questions that I personally cannot answer when I look at the concept, if it is a concept, from the perspective of how did it affect the current situation when we look at the case study of Ukraine. My second point is, what's the particular situation of the West? And here I think we are far more vulnerable than totalitarian systems that have the means to streamline public opinion and to control media. When we had the preparation for this meeting, I learned that we should avoid certain channels because these channels are filtered by algorithms, and these algorithms pop up the moment we say words that are not okay in a public debate. So we rather use something like YouTube to share our conversation with an interested public. And this is just an example of what is not happening in my ecosystem, in which the freedom of speech implies that we bite the hand that feeds us. And given that the pluralism that we are so proud of allows to give the freedom of speech to those, like freedom is the freedom of the other, and you can express the most absurd position and express stupid positions, and that's the freedom you have. This allows forms of influence in a Western cacophonic orchestra to be far more successful than in a controlled totalitarian environment. So therefore, one would expect that the West is far more vulnerable when it comes to financing parties that criticize the liberal positions and the principles of Western-type democracy. And the moment the Western system strikes back and tries to defend what it stands for, the open society, it restricts, and by restriction, it limits the freedom, and then it becomes a contradiction in terms. That a free West is no longer free because it imposes certain forms of censorship that is against its own principles. So therefore, it's a different way of attacking a system that is based on such principles in comparison with what the West could possibly do in Russia or in other systems that are far more state-controlled. And my last comment for, do I have a minute? I don't see the clock at this point. Anyway, the last point is, when I look at how successful Russia is in terms of influencing public opinion, then I don't really see much happening on the ground. We have demonstrations with a letter set to openly support in German streets the war by a minority, and this rather sort of mobilizes the opposition of those who believe that this is an illegitimate war, that it's violating international law, and we should stick to what the government stands for. So the West, as divided as it is by definition, because if we are pluralist, we have conflicting interests, and it's extremely difficult to speak with one voice, and we are certainly not the poodle of the United States that always says what Washington wants. But in a situation of being threatened, and the more further east you go, like Lithuania or the Baltic states in general, the more people feel personally threatened by what is happening there, because it's not a geographical question of will Russia get a chunk of Ukraine? It is, as all the speakers have highlighted, a geopolitical battle over what is the future balance in this world in a multipolar order, and what is the future of the small ones that have to find strategies to defend their position if multilateralism is as weak as Mr. Gupta pointed out, and I could only agree. I think I leave it here.